May 7th, 1945. Somewhere near the Elbe River, Germany. The metallic taste filled Friedrich Hartmann's mouth, not from fear, though fear was there, coiled tight in his chest, but from the shrapnel embedded in his left thigh. The fragment had entered 3 hours earlier, during the chaotic retreat through a birch forest where American artillery shells fell like thunder from a merciless god. Now, as he lay in the muddy ditch beside what remained of his unit, he could feel the warm wetness spreading beneath his torn uniform trousers. The SS runes on his collar, once worn with such pride, now felt like a death sentence tattooed into fabric. He was 23 years old. He had expected to die a hero. Instead, he would die in a ditch, drowning in his own blood, abandoned by the 1,000-year Reich that had promised eternity but delivered only 12 years of fire. The sound of boots, American boots, he could tell by their rhythm, heavier and more regular than the desperate stumbling of German retreat, grew closer. Friedrich's hand moved instinctively toward his Mauser, then stopped. What was the point? His fingers were already growing cold. The world tilted at strange angles. Through the buzz in his ears, he heard voices speaking in English, harsh and incomprehensible, and then hands, surprisingly gentle hands, lifting him. SS, someone said, and Friedrich heard the word like a condemnation. He waited for the bullet. It was what he would have done, what he had been taught to do. The bullet never came. To understand the magnitude of what Friedrich Hartmann experienced in those moments, and in the weeks, months, and years that followed, one must first understand what he had been taught to expect. The Waffen SS, that military wing of Heinrich Himmler's black uniformed empire, had indoctrinated nearly 900,000 men with a particular vision of the world. They were told they were the racial elite, the ideological vanguard, the iron fist of a new Germanic order. More importantly, they were told that their enemies, particularly the Americans, British, and Soviets, were subhuman monsters who would show no mercy to captured SS men. The propaganda had been consistent, relentless, effective. In the final months of the war, as the Reich crumbled, SS officers had told their men, better to die fighting than fall into enemy hands. They will torture you. They will execute you. They will make you wish you had died on the battlefield. Some of this propaganda was rooted in grim reality. The Waffen SS had, after all, participated in numerous war crimes, from the massacre at Malmedy, where 84 American prisoners were murdered in a Belgian field, to countless atrocities on the Eastern Front. The organization had been more than just a military formation. It had been the armed instrument of Nazi ideology, its divisions recruited and indoctrinated with particular attention to racial purity and ideological commitment. Even those who had been drafted in the later war years, like Friedrich, had been shaped by this environment. When the Third Reich finally collapsed in May 1945, approximately 200,000 Waffen SS soldiers found themselves in Allied captivity in the West, with hundreds of thousands more captured by Soviet forces in the East. Their fate would become one of the most complex and controversial chapters in the post-war reckoning with Nazi crimes. Friedrich Hartmann regained consciousness in a place that should not have existed according to everything he knew about the world. The tent was clean, impossibly clean, white canvas stretched overhead, filtering the afternoon sun into a soft, diffused glow. The smell struck him first, antiseptic, sharp and chemical, cutting through the expected odors of blood and gangrene. Then the sounds, not screaming, not chaos, but the organized murmur of medical work being conducted with systematic efficiency. He tried to sit up. His left leg, he discovered, was heavily bandaged. The shrapnel wound that had been killing him just how long ago? Hours, days, had been cleaned and stitched. An IV line ran into his arm, delivering clear fluid from a glass bottle suspended above his cot. His SS uniform had been removed, replaced with U.S. Army hospital pajamas. "Easy there, soldier." Friedrich turned his head. An American medic stood beside his bed, young, perhaps 20 years old, with sandy hair and freckles across his sunburned nose. He wore the Red Cross armband that, in Friedrich's previous understanding of the world, had been a sign of weakness. The man was adjusting the IV flow with practiced efficiency. "You're lucky," the medic continued in broken German. "Another hour and you would have bled out. Femoral artery was nicked. Doc Patterson got you patched up." Lucky. The word hung in the air like an impossible thing. Friedrich's throat was dry, his voice barely a whisper. Why? The American looked at him with an expression Friedrich couldn't quite parse. Not hatred, not even particular warmth, just a kind of professional matter-of-factness. Why what? Why did you save me? Friedrich gestured weakly at his own chest, at where the SS runes had been. You know what I am, the medic shrugged. Doc Patterson says we treat wounded, period. Says it's in the Geneva Convention or something. Besides, he checked the IV one more time and moved toward the next bed. You're just a kid. War's over anyway. Just a kid. War's over anyway. Friedrich lay back, staring at the white canvas ceiling, and felt the first crack appear in the edifice of everything he had believed. The American POW camps in Germany, and later in France and Belgium, became the first testing ground for a transformation that would reshape not just individual lives, but the entire political landscape of post-war Europe. In the immediate aftermath of surrender, the Allies faced a staggering logistical challenge. Millions of German soldiers to process, house, feed, and eventually reintegrate into civilian life. For Waffen SS prisoners, the experience began with fear. Many expected immediate execution. Some, particularly those who had served on the Eastern Front, attempted to conceal their SS membership by removing or altering their uniform markings, even burning away the blood-type tattoos that had been inked under their left arms. Friedrich Hartmann, immobilized by his injury, had no such option. His identity was clear, documented, undeniable. What followed was not execution, but something far more psychologically complex, a systematic process of reckoning. The first stage was interrogation. In a converted schoolhouse near Frankfurt, Friedrich found himself sitting across a wooden table from a U.S. Army intelligence officer named Captain Daniel Morrison. Morrison spoke flawless German. He had been a professor of European history at Columbia University before the war, and he approached the interview not with rage, but with an unsettling, clinical curiosity. Tell me about your service, Morrison said, opening a folder. Friedrich hesitated. Every instinct screamed that cooperation meant betrayal. But what was there left to betray? The Reich was ashes. The Führer was dead, though this fact still seemed impossible even now. His unit had scattered to the winds. I was drafted in 1943, Friedrich began, from Heidelberg. I was a university student, physics. They sent me first to Bad Tölz for officer training, then to the Eastern Front. 3rd SS Panzer Division, Totenkopf. Morrison made notes without looking up. Totenkopf, Death's Head. You know what that division did before you joined it? I know what we were told, that it was elite, that it had distinguished itself in combat. It massacred 100 British prisoners at Le Paradis in France in 1940. It participated in anti-partisan operations in Poland that killed thousands of civilians. These are documented facts, Herr Hartmann. The words landed like physical blows. Friedrich had heard rumors, whispers, things that were not discussed in polite company even among fellow SS men. But to have them stated so flatly, with such certainty. I never participated in anything like that. I was a tank gunner. We fought Soviet armor. Morrison finally looked up. His eyes were tired. I believe you. Most soldiers in most armies just follow orders. Fight the enemy in front of them. Try to survive. But here's what you need to understand. The organization you belonged to was criminal from top to bottom. Not because every individual member was a war criminal, but because the organization itself existed to implement criminal policies. He pulled several photographs from his folder and laid them on the table. Friedrich's stomach clenched. The images showed emaciated bodies stacked like cordwood, skeletal figures behind barbed wire, rooms filled with shoes and eyeglasses and human hair. Dachau, Morrison said quietly. Bergen-Belsen. Auschwitz. We've been liberating these places. The SS ran them. Not the Waffen-SS specifically, but it's all the same organization. You wore the same insignia as the men who operated the gas chambers. Friedrich stared at the photographs. His mind performed frantic calculations, searching for explanations, context, reasons why these images might be propaganda, exaggerations, lies. But something in Morrison's voice, the exhaustion, the genuine sadness, cut through the defensive mechanisms. "I didn't know," Friedrich whispered. "We didn't know about this." "Didn't you?" Morrison gathered the photographs. "Or didn't you want to know?" The question would haunt Friedrich Hartmann for the rest of his life. But in the summer of 1945, it was simply one shock among many that systematically dismantled his understanding of reality. The second shock came from the food. The POW camp near Regensburg, where Friedrich was transferred after his interrogation, housed approximately 15,000 German prisoners, including several thousand SS men, segregated into a separate compound. The men had arrived expecting starvation rations, brutal treatment, perhaps slow death from neglect. Instead, they found themselves receiving 2,700 calories per day, more than many German civilians were getting in the ruins of the Reich. The contrast was so stark that Friedrich initially suspected a trap. Why would the Americans waste resources feeding their enemies so well? The answer, he gradually learned, was partly practical. Healthy prisoners were less likely to cause trouble or spread disease, and partly ideological. The Americans, it seemed, actually believed in certain principles about human dignity that transcended national loyalty. Every morning breakfast arrived: oatmeal, bread, margarine, coffee. Real coffee, not the acorn substitute they'd been drinking for the last 2 years of the war. At lunch, stew with meat, vegetables, more bread. Dinner, variations on the same. The food wasn't delicious, it was institutional, mass-produced, often bland, but it was abundant and regular. Friedrich watched his fellow prisoners struggle to process this reality. Some refused to eat at first, convinced it was poison. Others gorged themselves and became sick from the sudden abundance after years of deprivation. A few wept openly at mealtimes, overwhelmed by the cognitive dissonance between expectation and experience. "They're fattening us up for something," muttered Klaus Schneider, a former Hauptsturmführer who slept in the bunk below Friedrich's. "Trying to make us soft before the real interrogations begin." But the real interrogations, at least the violent kind that propaganda had promised, never came. Instead, there were more conversations like the one with Captain Morrison, documents to fill out, work assignments, cleaning, construction, maintenance of the camp itself. The Americans seemed far less interested in revenge than in bureaucratic organization. The third shock came from the mail. 6 weeks after his capture, Friedrich received a letter from his mother in Heidelberg. The envelope had been opened and read by censors, standard procedure, but the contents were intact. His mother's handwriting, small and precise, covered 2 pages of thin paper. "My dearest Friedrich, we received word through the Red Cross that you are alive in an American captivity. You cannot imagine our relief. Your father wept, the first time I have seen him cry since your grandfather's funeral. We had heard nothing for 3 months and feared the worst. Heidelberg is intact, thank God. The Americans arrived in March with barely any fighting. They have been, I must choose my words carefully, they have been correct in their behavior. Not warm, but not cruel. They have established food distribution centers. The rations are small but regular. Your father has been allowed to continue working at the hospital, though he must undergo some kind of political investigation. The news about the camps, Friedrich, I do not know what to think. They have shown us films, photographs. Can this be true? Can our nation have done such things? Your father says he treated patients from Dachau in early 33, before we knew what it would become. He says he heard rumors but thought them exaggerated. Now we must face that they were not exaggerated. They were, if anything, understated. I write this not to burden you, but because you must know what awaits you when you return. The world we knew is gone, not just defeated, erased. We must reckon with what was done in our names. Your mother, who loves you always." Friedrich read the letter 7 times, memorizing each word. His father, a surgeon, a man of science and precision, weeping. His mother, who had hung the Führer's portrait in their dining room, now confronting the camps. The America he'd been taught to fear allowing his father to work, establishing food distribution, behaving correctly. Nothing made sense. Or rather, and this was more terrifying, Everything made sense in a completely different way than he'd been told. The Nuremberg trials began in November 1945 and would continue in various forms for several years. For the German public, and particularly for the hundreds of thousands of Waffen SS men gradually working their way through the Allied detention system, Nuremberg represented both a reckoning and a revelation. The trials were broadcast on radio, reported in newspapers, discussed in every camp and displaced persons center and bombed-out apartment across Germany. The evidence was overwhelming, methodical, impossible to dismiss as mere propaganda. Documents signed by Himmler, Heydrich, and dozens of other SS leaders detailed the systematic murder of millions. Survivors testified. Former guards broke down and confessed. Film footage from the liberated camps played in courtrooms and cinema halls across the occupation zones. On October 1, 1946, the International Military Tribunal declared the SS in its entirety, including the Waffen-SS, to be a criminal organization. The legal reasoning was precise. The SS had not merely committed crimes, it had existed specifically to implement the criminal policies of the Nazi regime. Membership itself, particularly for those who had joined voluntarily and served in leadership positions, could constitute a crime. For men like Friedrich Hartmann, this declaration landed with complicated impact. Yes, he had been drafted. Yes, he had not personally participated in atrocities, but he had worn the uniform, sworn the oath, served the organization. The tribunal's judgment allowed for individual review. Conscripts who had no knowledge of SS crimes might be exonerated, but the burden of proof was on the accused. In the POW camp, Friedrich watched men respond in different ways to the Nuremberg verdicts. Some maintained absolute denial, insisting that the evidence was fabricated, that the trials were mere victor's justice, that the entire proceeding was a Jewish conspiracy to destroy Germany. Others collapsed into despair or rage, unable to reconcile their service with the revealed truth. A few, a very few, began the painful process of genuine reckoning. Friedrich found himself in this last category, though he arrived there slowly, through a series of small admissions, rather than one dramatic conversion. He remembered a conversation from 1943, shortly after his arrival at the front. An older sergeant, a veteran of the Poland and France campaigns, had made a casual comment about cleaning up the rear areas. Friedrich had asked what that meant. The sergeant had looked at him with something between pity and contempt and said, "You're better off not knowing, university boy. Just focus on your gun." At the time, Friedrich had taken this as veteran wisdom. Focus on your job. Don't worry about things beyond your control. Now, with Nuremberg's revelations echoing through the camp, he understood it as willful ignorance transformed into moral cowardice. The sergeant had known. They had all known something, even if they hadn't known everything, and they had chosen not to look too closely. The release began in 1947, a slow trickle at first, then a flood. The Americans and British, facing mounting costs and pressure to demobilize their own forces, needed to empty the POW camps. The Soviets, meanwhile, kept their German prisoners much longer. Some would not return until the 1950s. The screening process for Waffen-SS prisoners was theoretically rigorous. Each man was supposed to undergo detailed investigation to determine his individual culpability. In practice, with hundreds of thousands of cases to process, the system was overwhelmed. Many investigations consisted of little more than a questionnaire and a brief interview. Friedrich's screening took place in January 1947, nearly 20 months after his capture. By this point, he had spent more time as a prisoner than he had actually serving in combat. His leg had healed, though he walked with a slight limp. His English had improved through regular contact with American guards. He had actually read, not just skimmed, dozens of books from the camp library, everything from American novels to technical manuals to translated accounts of the Nazi era written by German émigrés. The screening officer was a young lieutenant named Patrick O'Brien, who looked barely old enough to shave. "Says here you were drafted in 43, O'Brien read from Friedrich's file. "Served with 3rd SS Panzer Division Totenkopf on the Eastern Front. Wounded and captured in May 45. That about right?" "Yes, sir." "Any knowledge of war crimes committed by your unit?" This was the crucial question. Friedrich could have lied. Many did, and got away with it. But Morrison's words from that first interrogation echoed in his mind. Didn't you? Or didn't you want to know? I never witnessed executions of civilians or prisoners, Friedrich said carefully. But I heard things. Rumors about anti-partisan operations that didn't sound like military actions. I didn't investigate. I didn't ask questions. I told myself it wasn't my concern. O'Brien looked up from his papers, surprised by the honesty. That's more than most guys in here will admit to. I'm not proud of it, sir. Yeah, well, O'Brien made some notations. You're being released with a Category 4 designation. Follower, no evidence of individual crimes. You'll be required to undergo denazification proceedings once you return to civilian life. You'll be ineligible for certain government positions and will face restrictions on political activity. Could be worse. Could be worse. Friedrich thought about the 16 men from his unit who had been identified as having participated in the massacre of Soviet prisoners and were awaiting trial. He thought about the SS officers who had been hanged at Nuremberg. He thought about the millions who hadn't survived the war at all. Yes, sir, he said quietly. It could be worse. The Germany that Friedrich Hartmann returned to in February 1947 was a landscape of physical and moral devastation. Heidelberg had been spared the worst of the bombing, but the psychological ruins were everywhere. His father had lost his position at the hospital during denazification. Too many compromises with the regime, too much looking the other way, and now worked as a general practitioner from their apartment. His mother had aged a decade in 2 years. The stigma of SS service was immediate and crushing. When Friedrich attempted to re-enroll at the university to continue his physics studies, he was informed that former Waffen SS members were barred from higher education for a minimum of 5 years. When he applied for jobs, any jobs, employers saw the SS designation on his papers and found excuses to hire someone else. I fought for my country, he said to his father one evening, frustration boiling over. His father, gaunt, exhausted, haunted, looked at him with something close to pity. You fought for a criminal regime. There's a difference. I was drafted, and you served, and you chose not to question. We all chose not to question. His father's voice cracked slightly. I treated patients who had been tortured at Dachau and told myself they must have done something to deserve it. I heard stories about Jews being deported and told myself they were probably just being resettled. We all made those choices, Friedrich. Now we live with the consequences. The hardest part, harder than the poverty, harder than the rejection, harder than the physical scars, was the loss of innocence about his own moral capacity. Friedrich had believed himself to be a good person, an ordinary person who had done his duty in extraordinary circumstances. Nuremberg and its aftermath had revealed a more complex and unsettling truth. Ordinary people, good people, people who loved their families and enjoyed music and wanted to live decent lives, could serve monstrous systems, not through exceptional evil, but through ordinary cowardice, through choosing comfort over conscience, through asking too few questions. The first meeting of HIAG, the Hilfsgemeinschaft auf Gegenseitigkeit der Angehörigen der ehemaligen Waffen-SS, or Mutual Help Association of former Waffen-SS members, took place in 1951 in Hanover. By this point, the Cold War had transformed the political landscape. West Germany was being rehabilitated as a bulwark against Soviet expansion. Former Wehrmacht officers were being recruited to build the new Bundeswehr. The Americans, once so focused on denazification, were now more concerned with anti-communism. Into this changing climate, HIAG emerged with a clear mission: to rehabilitate the image of the Waffen-SS, to secure pension rights for its veterans, and to rewrite the narrative from criminal organization to soldiers like any others. Friedrich attended one HIAG meeting in 1953 out of curiosity and a need for connection with men who shared his experience. The venue was a beer hall in Frankfurt, thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of cheap lager. Perhaps 200 men were present, ranging from former privates to high-ranking officers. The speaker was a former SS brigade Führer named Hans Meyer, who spoke with the kind of charismatic confidence Friedrich remembered from his training days. Gentlemen, Meyer proclaimed, we have been slandered. The victors, guided by certain interests that we all understand, have painted the Waffen SS with the same brush as the concentration camp guards, but we were frontline soldiers. We fought with honor against tremendous odds. We defended Western civilization against the Bolshevik hordes. The room erupted in applause. Men who had spent years being spat on in the street, denied jobs, treated as pariahs, were finally hearing what they wanted to hear, that they had been warriors, not criminals, that their service had meant something, that they could hold their heads high. Friedrich didn't applaud. He thought about Captain Morrison's photographs. He thought about his father's words. We all chose not to question. He thought about the sergeant who had told him he was better off not knowing. When the meeting ended, Friedrich walked out into the Frankfurt night and never attended another Hayek gathering. He had learned something crucial in that beer hall, that rehabilitation without reckoning was just another form of denial, that the need to feel good about one's past could override the imperative to face uncomfortable truths. The 1950s and 60s in West Germany were decades of what historians would later call selective memory. The Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle, provided material comfort and a convenient distraction from moral questions. Many former Waffen-SS men found employment in the booming economy, obtained limited pension rights, and gradually reintegrated into society. Some even achieved positions of influence in business and politics. Friedrich Hartmann followed a different path. He never completed his physics degree. The educational restrictions and his own psychological struggles made it impossible. Instead, he found work as a technical translator, using the languages he had learned in the POW camp and the precision he had learned in his aborted studies. It was quiet work, anonymous work, work that kept him at the edges of things. He married in 1956, a woman named Anna who had lost her first husband in the bombing of Hamburg. They had 2 children, a boy and a girl. Friedrich never told them about his SS service until they were teenagers, and even then, he struggled to find the words. "Were you a Nazi?" his son asked in 1972, during an argument about politics. Friedrich considered the question carefully. The easy answer would have been, "No, I was just a soldier." The true answer was more complicated. "I served a Nazi regime," he said finally. "I believed what I was told to believe. Or at least, I didn't question it hard enough. I participated in a system that committed great evil, even though I didn't personally commit those crimes. So yes, in a meaningful sense, I was part of it. And I've spent 30 years trying to understand how that happened and making sure it doesn't happen again." His son, raised in the prosperity and democracy of the Federal Republic, looked at his father with something between incomprehension and respect. The gap between generations, between experiences, was unbridgeable in some ways. But at least, Friedrich thought, at least there could be honesty. He had disbanded in 1992, its membership aging into irrelevance, its historical revisionism thoroughly discredited by decades of scholarly research. The final nail came from the opening of Eastern European archives after the fall of communism, which provided overwhelming documentation of Waffen-SS participation in atrocities. The organization that had insisted its members were soldiers like any others could no longer sustain that fiction in the face of evidence. But the legacy of Hayek, the tension between acknowledgement and denial, between reckoning and rehabilitation, continued to shape European politics. In the Baltic states and Ukraine, some Waffen-SS units composed of local volunteers were reframed as anti-Soviet resistance fighters, a characterization that ignored their collaboration with Nazi genocidal policies. In Germany itself, debates continued about whether Waffen-SS veterans deserved pensions, whether their service could ever be separated from the crimes of the organization, whether any form of recognition was appropriate. Friedrich Hartmann died in 2003 at the age of 81. In his final years, he had become a reluctant speaker at schools and community centers, telling his story as a cautionary tale. Not to absolve himself, he was always clear that his service, however coerced, had been part of a criminal system, but to warn younger generations about the seductions of ideology, the dangers of unquestioning obedience, the ease with which ordinary people could become complicit in extraordinary evil. His last public appearance was at a gymnasium in Heidelberg, speaking to students who had been born decades after the events he described. They asked him questions he had been asking himself for 60 years. How could you not have known about the camps? We knew something. We chose not to know more. That's different from ignorance. It's willful blindness. Do you think you were a bad person? I think I was an ordinary person in extraordinary circumstances who made choices I regret. Whether that makes me bad, I don't know. But I know it makes me responsible. What should we learn from this? Friedrich paused, gathering his thoughts one final time. That it can happen anywhere, to anyone. That the people who commit great evils are usually not monsters. They're people like you and me, who convince themselves they're just following orders, just doing their jobs, just serving their country. The lesson is to question, always question, especially when everyone around you is certain they're right. On May 7th, 2005, exactly 60 years after the day Friedrich Hartmann was captured, a small memorial was dedicated in the former POW camp near Regensburg. The site had been a parking lot for decades, then a small museum about the occupation years. The memorial was modest, a stone plaque listing the approximate number of prisoners who had passed through the camp, both German and later displaced persons from across Eastern Europe. At the dedication ceremony, a retired U.S. Army medical officer named Thomas Morrison, son of Captain Daniel Morrison, who had died in 1998, gave a brief speech about his father's work interviewing SS prisoners. My father believed, Morrison said, that even the worst systems are made up of individuals, and that individuals are capable of change. He spent 2 years interviewing former SS men, trying to understand how they had become what they became. He was often disappointed, but he never stopped believing that understanding was necessary, even when forgiveness was impossible. Anna Hartmann, Friedrich's widow, attended the ceremony. She was 92 years old, accompanied by her children and grandchildren. When the speeches ended and the small crowd dispersed, she approached Morrison. "Your father interviewed my husband," she said, "in 1945. Friedrich spoke about it often. He said your father was the first person who made him think rather than simply defend himself." Morrison nodded. "I've read some of my father's reports. I remember the name, Hartmann, physics student, drafted 43, 3rd Panzer Division. That was him." Anna's eyes were wet. "Your father helped save his life twice, once in the medical tent, though Friedrich never met the doctor who operated on him, and once through those questions, the ones that made him face what he'd been part of." They stood together in silence for a moment, two elderly people linked by a 60-year-old conversation between their spouses, surrounded by German teenagers who were taking photos with their phones and chatting about weekend plans. Normal, banal, blissfully unaware that normalcy itself had once been an impossible luxury. "He made something of himself," Anna said finally, "despite everything, or maybe because of everything. He spent his life trying to be better than what he'd been." "That's all any of us can do," Morrison replied. The memorial plaque gleamed in the afternoon sun. Tourists would walk past it for years to come, most barely noticing, some pausing to read, a very few stopping to truly think about what it meant that this place, this ordinary parking lot in Bavaria, had once held thousands of men who had served the worst regime in modern history, and that most of them had been released, returned to civilian life, and shaped the world that came after. The story of the Waffen SS after the war is not one story but thousands, of men who remained unrepentant until death, of men who broke under the weight of their guilt, of men who built new lives while carefully avoiding any examination of their old ones, and of men like Friedrich Hartmann who spent decades trying to understand how they had become what they became. There are no clean endings to such stories, no satisfying resolutions, just the slow, painful work of reckoning, individual and collective, with choices made and unmade, with roads taken and not taken, with the terrible ordinariness of evil and the difficult ordinariness of moral recovery. The teenagers finished taking their photos and wandered off toward the ice cream shop down the street. Anna Hartmann and Thomas Morrison exchanged contact information and promised to stay in touch. The sun moved lower in the sky, and somewhere, in archives and libraries and fading memories, the documents remained: interrogation transcripts, medical records, denazification files, pension applications, Chiag newsletters, scholarly monographs, oral histories. The accumulated weight of evidence and experience, testifying to a truth that each generation must learn anew, that it is easier to become complicit than to resist, easier to follow than to question, easier to accept comforting lies than uncomfortable truths. But also this, that recognition, however late, however incomplete, matters. That the long road from denial to acknowledgement, from justification to responsibility, is worth traveling. That mercy, unexpected, unearned, transformative, can create space for moral reckoning that vengeance never could. On May 7, 1945, Friedrich Hartmann lay in a ditch waiting to die, believing he understood the world. On May 7, 2005, 60 years later, a small crowd gathered to remember a time when ordinary men faced the consequences of extraordinary evil. And some, not all, not even most, but some, found the courage to change. That perhaps is the lesson. Not that redemption is easy or guaranteed, but that it remains possible. That the capacity for self-deception is matched by the capacity for self-examination. That the same species capable of creating Auschwitz is also capable of building the institutions, however imperfect, that try to ensure it never happens again. The story of the Waffen SS after World War II is, in the end, a story about all of us. About the choices we make when ideology demands obedience, about the truths we choose to see or ignore, about the persons we become through accumulation of small decisions that seem, in the moment, too small to matter. They matter. They always matter. That is the final lesson Friedrich Hartmann learned in a medical tent on May 7, 1945, when unexpected mercy cracked open his certainty and let the light stream in.